So we are joined today on the Red Nation podcast by one returning guest and a new guest. We have Sardana and Masha, who will be talking about their new podcast and project called TYMSYY. Before we get into that podcast project, maybe we can just start with introductions, where you're calling from, and give a little bit of background information about your work and what you do. And we'll start with Masha.
Hi, everyone. My name is Masha, and I'm currently in Indonesia. So I'm in the tropics. It's really hot here, and it's late night, so I'm actually getting quite sleepy. But I just graduated with my PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Manitoba. But we've been friends with Sardana for a very long time. We went our undergraduate studies together, and then we did our masters in the same city, and then in the US, and then now, and then we also went to University of Manitoba. So it's like we've had a long story of our friendship, I guess. But my research is on Indigenous women and resistance for land rights. I conducted my research in the province of North Sumatra in Indonesia, and then looking at the gender dynamics of a struggle for land rights among the Batak Toba communities in the province of North Sumatra. And so that's kind of like and then I've worked for a long time in Indonesia before that, and also in the Philippines and Thailand. And then I also worked after completing my PhD, then I worked with Indigenous women in Canada, as well as with other women who experience gender-based violence. So that's me.
And Sardana.
My name is Sardana. I'm also from the Sakha Republic, and as Masha said, we have been friends for a very long time. I did my studies in Russia, in the United States, and in Canada. I got my PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Manitoba. And now I'm calling from the University of Toronto, where I'm doing the postdoctoral fellowship. At first, I did with the Department of Political Science, and now I'm doing a postdoc with the engineering department. There is a story there. There is a very long story, but yeah, that's me.
Well, thank you both for joining. I'm a little, we had a pretty awesome conversation with Sardana last time about her work in Indigenous diamonds, and also the history of Indigenous people in what is now the Russian Federation, but also formerly Soviet Union, which is very fascinating and eye-opening. And I have some questions about the perspective that you have, that isn't from the so-called like global North or the imperial core in terms of the research that you do. But before we get into that kind of conversation, I do want you to maybe talk a little bit about the title of this podcast. As well as what you both hope to accomplish from this project. And either one, we can direct it back at Sardana and then have Masha talk if that's easier.
Okay, I think, but I think maybe it's a very good idea for Masha to start, because it was originally her idea to have the podcast focusing on the Indigenous issues. So maybe Masha, you can start and I can add.
Yeah, so TYMSYY actually stands for, I don't know if this is a correct, an accurate representation of the word, but it's stands for a gathering or coming together. And the reason why, and it's actually Sardana who kind of came up with that idea. So I'll let her speak a little bit more about with the title for the podcast when we started talking about it in more concrete terms. But originally, actually, that was 2 years back. I was working on Indigenous women's activism in Canada in terms of addressing gender-based violence. And at the time when I was also working on Indigenous research methodologies and kind of thinking a little bit more about that. And at that time, when I started kind of looking more in depth into that, I went to a number of workshops and trainings and things like that when I was in Winnipeg. And one of the workshops that I went to, there was a professor, her name is Brenda Gunn. And when she was presenting about her work, and, I read a number of her articles and everything, and I love the way she writes. But at the same time, when she was talking, I was like, oh my God, like that sounds so interesting, like the way she talks about her work. And I just felt like, like I wish that, a lot more people could access, not only on the university campus, that a lot more people could access these kind of knowledge and this kind of information that is coming directly from the people, that is, the research that people are doing, which are various pieces of research looking at various aspects of Indigenous lives and lived experiences. And so for me, so that's kind of like when I started thinking about it, and I was like, oh my God, like that would be really nice to actually have people talk about their stories and their communities and different kinds of research projects that they conduct. And that's when I started talking about it with Sardana. I said, like I have this idea that, maybe we should create a podcast or something like that along those lines. And just the idea is to bring together, various researchers, people, activists, scholars, artists, talking about the work that they do that can be inspiring to other people, and especially for Indigenous young people, for example. And the idea that we had, and so I shared a concept note with Sardana and another friend of mine, and then that's kind of when we started developing the concept. And the original idea was to have, and I think it still remains, to have a multilingual podcast that is both in Sakha, which is our native language, the original idea was to have, and it still remains to be, I think the idea that we have is to make it multilingual, that it would be in both Sakha, our native language. So we're both bilingual and Russian, but also English as well. So we're hoping that it would be like a podcast that would be for a lot of people who can speak our native languages, but also in English as well, because there's a lot of research that is out there that's written in English too, or like done by English-speaking Indigenous scholars, activists, artists, and other creators, I guess. So that's kind of the idea, the original idea. And so, and then at the time also, I asked Sardana, like, because I think she was getting a little bit more involved with CETA and others, and then I asked her, can you do a little bit of research? And that's when, I think Sardana started talking with Sina, and that's when, it kind of started to come about, to come into fruition, I guess. So the ideologist was me, and then the driver was Sardana, I guess, in this case. She was the person who kind of, who made it possible. Yeah.
Because, yeah, but it's another thing is because like it's a lot of labor is involved, like in recording and editing and everything. And Sina from the Red Nation, he was like, like I'm going to do everything for, like for you. You don't have to worry about that. You just need to find interesting people and to record, like and have these conversations. And I was like, why not? Like we are academics after all, and we just like talk all the time. So right. With like endlessly. So maybe like we can just like do that because there's so many people, very interesting people and the members of the Indigenous communities globally. And a lot of them, they're doing such important and interesting work. And we envision, like to try to bring them to the public, mostly in the West, but also in our home communities. Uh, because like if you look at we did some search, what kind of topics most of the Indigenous podcasts they focus on in the West, and mostly focus on the local issues, which is very important. But at the same time, there are so many topics, like and the issues and the problems are the local Indigenous peoples facing in other places. So we thought that there is a niche, like there is this podcast niche that needs to be filled, and we're ready to fill it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's like there are so many different stories, right? And different kind of situations that people face and all kinds of yeah, there's so much diversity of experiences that we thought that, it's something that's important to also bring forward to the table and yeah, make it available to people so that yeah, it's kind of bringing forward various Indigenous voices.
Yeah, it's interesting too because I think when people think of Indigenous studies, they have something very kind of if they know anything about Indigenous peoples, but they have something specific in mind, especially when it comes to North America. And I think the field itself, as it has developed into a global field, it also kind of remains, for better or worse, sometimes for worse, anchored in North America in what comes out of the universities. That's partly to do just with the fact of imperialism and the academy and resources, etc. And I do think that just in my conversations with Sardana, but also in conversations that I've had with comrades from like Bolivia and elsewhere throughout the world, I don't think people really consider indigeneity outside of the frame of Canada and the United States when you're in it. And so it's often and sometimes we are guilty of it as well. But I'm in a field that's called American Indian Studies, which is very specific to the sort of federal relation between the United States and what are the indigenous nations within what is now the United States. That's a very kind of specific field, but that doesn't mean that it's only about us, because it is, a global phenomenon. And you mentioned something, Masha, and I wanted to ask you about this notion of indigenous research methodologies, and how do you expand, because you both have done studies in Canada. You've got your degrees from Canada. How do you expand, like where do you see um, what is coming out of these universities in Canada and the US helpful for the work that you're doing, but then how are you moving beyond sort of those sort of research methodologies that you've been introduced to? Because Masha, you're in Indonesia. You've said that you've done research in the Philippines and elsewhere, and Sardana, your primary site is the Sakha Republic. So yeah, what are the possibilities within the context of the university systems that you came out of, but then also where are you guys trying to move in terms of expanding that frame?
Yeah, I think it's well actually I think in terms of expanding the frame, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about actually for the last week because um and it's something that it comes from the North American and mostly I guess not only North America but like New Zealand as well and Australia. I think the conversations are happening around Indigenous research methodologies. I think are mostly like in those countries, Kansas, or like how do you call them altogether? Can America? No, not exactly. That's inclusive exclusive of I guess New Zealand and Australia. But yeah, like these English influenced um, or English colonies, I guess. Like how would you how do you call them?
Anglo settler colonies.
Yes, Anglo settler colonies. Um, but it's something that I like. When I was studying, I was conducting my research in North Sumatra. I framed it as a decolonizing as well. However, I think it's I feel like after having thought about it, and I think maybe I haven't given it a lot of thought, and I'm just thinking. I've been thinking a lot about it, like in terms of like how do you like what is the relevance of these methodologies to places like Indonesia or like even Sakha Republic. And I think they're very relevant, obviously, because like the way the conversations have started is because of how research has often been exploitative. I think that's kind of like the main point of indigenous research methodologies, right? And I think in that way, I think the relevance of it is very global because of how harmful research has been in the past and continues to be. And I think just breaking that and thinking about how to make it actually useful to the communities that you work with, whoever those, like whether they're indigenous or not. I think that's kind of like a really important contribution of indigenous research methodologies and the discussions and the kind of implications, practical implications that these kind of thinking has, or frame of thought has. And I think in that way, I think it can be universally, like in different contexts, applicable in different contexts outside of the Anglo settler colonies, I guess. In terms of how, like the nuances, like what are the things that are relevant for various contexts, I think we just have to see in those contexts, I think. And then I think the other important point of indigenous research methodologies is also like pointing out the fact of like cultural imperialism and how knowledge has been affected by those power dynamics between the colonizers and the colonized, right? And it's something that I think in various like so-called post-colonial contexts, I think it still stays relevant as well, because knowledge has been created and continues to be created in ways that are very Eurocentric and that center like Western ways of thinking, I guess. And I think indigenous methodologies kind of bring that in a very, I think, poignant way, like to the forefront of discussions around knowledge creation. And I think that's important. So I think like those 2 points for me, it seemed to be the most relevant ones. And then nuances around like how do you do that, like how do you make it possible in different contexts, so what are the kinds of different discussions that people can have around implementing or applying indigenous research methodologies. Then I think that's a very different question. And then in terms of like research being exploitative, like when I was conducting my research in North Sumatra, like a lot of the people were asking questions around like all these people come, and not only like oftentimes obviously outsiders, because it's usually young students who come and conduct research in the communities. And so they would say, but we haven't seen any use of these research projects. And I think that's kind of also like universal experience all around for various communities. Yeah. Sardana, you wanted to add something? Like, I think like in the Sakha Republic case, I think maybe like the dynamics also a little bit different, but maybe generally that's kind of what we have. But then, there are nuances too, right? About how we approach the processes of knowledge creation and how we understand that.
I think like, because I did my research in the Sakha Republic in our home region, but also, like I spent some time in South Africa, like I did my studies in the States, in Canada, and I spent some time in Germany. And one of the things that always bothered me is the like seeing specifically our home region, as this frontier, like in a sense, the academic frontier that is accessible and it can be exploited and extracted, like the local indigenous knowledge can be extracted very easily because where we're from, like in academia, people don't necessarily talk about a lot about indigenous research methodologies, but also about how extractive the Western academia and the Western academics are when they come, like to our home region. So, and that's why, because it bothered me so much, like when I was doing my own research, and I realized that in other places, like for example in Australia, in New Zealand, here they actually talk about that, like ethics that need to be ethical. Like they don't necessarily follow the rules, like because like I remember that the local scholars, indigenous scholars, they had a lot of complaints about the European and the predominantly American anthropologists, like social scientists, coming to our home region, like and essentially just exploiting the scholars, but also extracting the knowledges, like from the local communities and using them for their own benefit, like writing the dissertations and dissertations and the articles and the books. And as Masha said, without any return to the local communities. And it's like, and most of them, they just come and go, like there is no any like input, like coming from that. There is no any collaboration. And it's like, it just, again, like it bothered me so much. And that's why when I came here, I started thinking about why is it like that? Like why all of these anthropologists and the social scientists and other academics, like they see our home region as an academic frontier, like they can come and just exploit. And so, like I guess like my own thinking started from that time. And also, like how they create these discourses about our communities and our people and our land, which is the knowledge that is easily used to benefit the Western imperialism. And it also didn't sit very well with me. So that's why I guess, like this is the one of the catalysts, I think, I guess, like the to start thinking more critically about indigenous research methodologies, but also, like applications and the practices. But also kind of like expanding, because we talked about that in other podcasts, like the implications intended and the unintended consequences of indigenous with indigenous research. Like if you are a scholar from one indigenous context, but you're working with the communities, like community members within the very different indigenous context, like how it affects you as an academic, as a scholar, as a researcher, your identity, but also, like the research and the knowledge that you produce. So, like we're trying to expand the thinking about indigenous research methodologies that way.
Yeah, and it's funny because like I just had a kind of like a guest lecture or something like that, like a presentation at a theological institute actually last week here in Indonesia, in the city of Malang, and we talked about indigenous or like decolonizing research methodologies, and one of the kind of key questions was in terms of the fact that, okay, so you're centering these indigenous knowledges, and that's important, but at the same time, what about the theoretical perspectives that come from the Western academia, such as, for example, feminism and others that can be useful in terms of understanding the power dynamics within Indigenous communities, like critical analysis of the power dynamics that exist. And so that's kind of like, those are the kinds of questions that I think are relevant in terms of like having more in-depth discussion about that, right? Like, and I think that within Indigenous research methodologies, there's, for example, that concept of two-eyed seeing approach, where I think it comes from the Canadian Indigenous communities, where you're like applying two kind of eyes. One is the Western eye and the other one is the Indigenous eye. But like, there is different approaches in terms of like, how do you tackle the fact that there is gender-based violence, for example, within Indigenous communities that can be connected to some of the cultural practices, for example. So that's kind of like, those are the kinds of discussions that I guess, or like the challenge that needs, like, you have to have a little bit more discussion around that. Like, how do you do that? What does it mean? Like in understanding the expressions of violence that exist, or like structural violence, cultural violence, all kinds of forms of violence that exist within the communities, and how do you address that? So that's kind of like something interesting, some of the questions that people asked here in Indonesia. Yeah.
You both talked about something, like two kind of aspects I want to get into, and the first is sort of this notion of an Indigenous researcher, which I assume we all kind of inhabit that position, whether we like it or not, but because it's always pointed out, but we're never allowed to point out sort of the Western imperialist white researcher, because they're universal, and they can go anywhere and they can shift. Like, how many times do we know people in our field who are studying indigeneity, then they move on to something else, or we're just kind of like a stopping point for their career, and they can move through the world. They can move to different subjects. They can move, they can become experts. This is like a we wrote on this in a book. It's called The Indian Expert, or you could even call it the Indigenous Expert. But they always like, they always like roll these people out. And there's like so many white guys in the United States who like reach out to me. They're like, I wrote a book about Native people. And it's like, so what? Like, does it make you, it's like, you're like just about, you're like 30% of the population. You discovered Indians and you read a book about it. So great. That doesn't make you an expert on anything. But it's not just Native people, right? We see this happen with different subjects. But I also think what's fascinating is there's this notion of like an Indigenous researcher, where there is a different level of accountability, and there is a different level of relationships, and expectation. I think it's actually more difficult in some ways, especially when you're researching your own community, because you could you could make serious mistakes that would have serious consequences for you. There's that aspect of it. And then I think there's another layer, where from the perspective that both of you are writing from, and what I try to write from, is this notion, like of imperialism. Sure, there's cultural imperialism, but there's also like just imperialism in general, where you could be giving a talk, which this actually happened to me, where I'm expected to denounce China for some reason, or I'm expected to denounce Russia, or I'm expected to denounce whatever enemy of the United States exists at that particular moment. And if I don't make those denunciations, then I could be, blacklisted or dismissed, or like my research could be dismissed. Or if I want to talk about something that happened, even if I don't agree with it, like in the context of my own research, there's things that our people have done, relationships that they've made with groups and countries. And it's not like I'm like, I give this a rubber stamp of approval. I'm just writing about it because I think it's fascinating to show and to understand how we understood internationalism, that we don't just have to interact or make relations with our colonizers, right? That we can have these sort of horizontal relations and conversations, whether it's at the United Nations or whether it's at some other kind of forum. That, like, for example, we sent delegations to the Soviet Union, we sent delegations to Vietnam, we sent delegations to the Middle East, all over the place, and that's how we understood the world, through those kind of experiences. but there's kind of this expectation that like indigeneity can be also weaponized, or the indigenous researcher can be weaponized against um, the whatever sort of enemy of empire exists at that particular moment in time. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that. It's something I've been thinking, I kind of been wrestling with lately, especially in the context of the United States, and just even how some indigenous researchers do buy into this kind of pro-imperialist, pro-NATO, whatever you want to call it, kind of perspective. And we laugh, but it's true. Like we see it all the time. It's like I don't know why you're denouncing Russia. Like, what did Russia ever do to you? Is Russia like drilling oil and gas on your lands? Are they exploiting? Is, you know, you're expected to denounce China? It's like, did China come and kill your dog? You know, like I don't know what what happened. but there's this response, and I don't know if you guys have any like reflections on that, but it happens a lot to me. I don't know if it happens to you as much, but especially in this kind of research and work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah, it like, you know, like it happens all the time. The especially, you know, like when people realize that, you know, like we do have the experiences growing up during the Soviet Union, and there is this expectation that you need to denounce that, you know, like, and you need to completely reject, you know, like the experiences, some positive experiences that you had growing at that time. And since 2022, you know, like there's also this expectation that you need to say something about, you know, like what is happening with this conflict with Ukraine and Russia. And I always felt that, you know, like people always like look at you, you know, like would they, like when you introduce yourself, like when you say like, oh, you know, like I'm from the Sakha Republic, which is the northeastern part of Russia, and like they have this, you know, like look that they're waiting me to say something, you know, like like having the microphone and like say something. And I was like literally make some, you know, like they make the United Nations announcement or whatever. And I was like, I always think, you know, like it's so ridiculous, you know, like why you're not asking, you know, like Americans, you know, like they when they go to other places, you know, like why you don't expect them, you know, like to denounce their government, you know, like in their country, you know, like during the what is happening in Iraq or in Iran or in other places. And so like it, I completely I personally completely disregard, you know, like these kind of things, because I find them to be ridiculous, you know, like, and very inappropriate, you know, like, and having this kind of expectation from someone like, you know, like me, let's say, you know, like someone who's coming from the area where I'm coming from, you know, like, in the working with the communities that I work with, it's just like, I find it to be very inappropriate. Yeah. This is my like, you know, like personal thinking. But maybe like other people are more comfortable, you know, like with expressing their political opposition or whatever. But you know, like, yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny because like when I was and like I have two different experiences, right? Which is like in Canada and then in Indonesia. In Indonesia it's very different. Like nobody expects you to express your, you know, like there's no expectation like that. Like
Yeah,
it just doesn't, like it's just a very different way of functioning, and people are not judged based on their you know, where they come from, and you know, that's and then the whole Russia, you know, situation, um Russian Ukrainian conflict, it's not really even like part of the, like nobody sides with anyone really, like it's not like you're not expected to denounce anyone. So so that's kind of like the situation in Indonesia, right? But like when I was in Canada, even before I think the Russian Ukrainian conflict, um when I was taking classes as part of the doctoral program, I had a classmate, a colleague of mine, and I think we were having a class or something, and I said, you know, my uncle, and in Russia itself right now, like being like Communist Party, especially in our part of the country, is like really popular. Right? I think they get at least 30% of votes, like every time, every election. And so, and like some of the leaders of the Communist Party, they're very popular too. Like they're not exactly, maybe like ideologically, maybe they're not exactly, the same as they used to be like during the Soviet Union, but it's still kind of a party that exists and is still popular. And so, and in one of my conversations, or like class discussions, I think I mentioned that my uncle was a member, like of the Communist Party during the Soviet Union. Like he was an agriculturalist and like really active socially until now. And I was turned into the enemy of the people.
And then you
Because like, so I was really taken aback. I was called a Putinist. I was, like it was just like, I'm like why would you do that? Like I just said that my uncle was well, used to be a member of the like, and still is a member of the community. Like that's just like, and I was so surprised, and I was like, "What's going
What a
on?" Like
crime for growing
I didn't really
food.
get
What a
it.
crime. Being a farmer,
Yeah.
those dirty farmers.
So I'm like,
oh god.
and then I had to think, like part of it, I think for me, I was like, okay, maybe because I'm like a racialized person, like I'm not a white Russian, maybe that's why. Like if I were a white person, even though Russian, and even though I had an like maybe that would have been a very different reaction, but because I am indigenous and I dare, my uncle dares to be a supporter of the Communist Party during the Soviet Union, then it's like, then I become the enemy of
But
the
it's also
people.
very interesting though, like because I noticed that the somehow like seeing some positive aspects of socialism and communism here is considered to be backward. Like you're backward. Like you don't want to be developed. Like you're not progressive. And I was like, it's the opposite. It's like literally the opposite. But and like one of the things is like even the younger people in our home region who grew up in 1990s, like late 1990s, 2000s, they have the same way of thinking, like, and they completely dismiss the experiences of their parents and grandparents, and they even like came up with these terms that they use in order to describe like people who grew up during the Soviet Union. Masha, maybe you're familiar with the word savok, and it just like makes me like angry like every time when I hear that. So savok means like like the Soviet, so it's kind of like play on the word is like Soviet. But also savok in Russian, like it's a duster. Like you collect the dust. Like you.
Oh, dustpan.
Dustpan. Oh, okay, dustpan. Oh, that says something else. Okay, English is not my first language.
No, it's totally fine.
It's the third. Anyway, so it's a dustpan. So it's a dustpan. Like, and this is how they refer and characterize, like all the people who grew up during that time, like, and who dare to have some positive memories that they call nostalgia. And I was like, this is not nostalgia, like this is the actual base, like on the material experiences that people had at the time, like. So, and it always makes me very irritated. And I think like, like the same way of thinking, that if you think positively about socialism or communism, like you're backward. And especially, like when it's in relation to indigenous peoples, right? So you're backward because you're indigenous. But if you, like think positively about communism, socialism, like you're even more backward. So, so there's no any way around. Oh,
Yeah, there's it just makes me think about like how socialism in the context of like the Cold War, indigenous studies actually kind of arose at this in the Cold War, right? Especially in the global north. And they were using terms like indigenous and indigenous peoples and territory as ways to attack these projects. Yeah, I really appreciate that kind of perspective, because it's like there isn't the same level of expectation for people coming from the United States or Canada to denounce their governments. Nobody calls them Trudeauists or carnists
Yeah.
or
Somehow, like they're separated from their governments.
yeah, it's true. And it's like somehow like people from these, like whether you're from Russia or China or whatever, you are now a spokesperson on behalf of the government. And but it doesn't, I think what's fascinating for me is that there's no connection to like how sanctions or like how the sort of imperialist supply chain of extraction, whatever industry you want, is connected to the subjugation of indigenous people in these, in these regions, whether it's in Russia, whether it's like in Venezuela. I did research in Venezuela, in southern Venezuela, and they were very impacted by sanctions in terms of like their local economy was destroyed by US imposed, unilateral sanctions. And nobody talked about that. Everyone's like, but then they want to sort of wave the banner of like, we're pro-indigenous, and like, these socialist governments or whatever are anti-indigenous, and they don't want to listen to any indigenous person who's part of PSUV, which is the ruling party, the socialist ruling party. And they're overrepresented, within the National Assembly, because it's just very popular. It's empowered people in ways. There's also critics. It's not like they're just dupes. They have a very nuanced understanding of the state and the party and their own relationship to this project. They're not just like just dupes and just kind of like completely brainwashed. But I think people think that, and even what Masha was saying earlier, it's like, even just talking about objective facts, like this is the reality. My uncle was part of the communist, or is part of the Communist Party. He was an agriculturalist during the Soviet Union. My impulse would be like, that's fascinating. I want to learn more because I don't know anything about this. But instead there's this arrogance and this hubris that is like, I'm going to denounce this because this is just fundamentally bad, and it can only be bad, and that's all we should know about it, is just like it's some kind of horrific thing. Not to say like, China is a country, a nation of more than 1 billion people. We don't know anything about it. Like,
But it's also, like when I think
or-
about that, like in the West, people think about the other countries, like and the population, the people in these countries, like in a very racist way, like they think about the people that, like, oh, people in other countries, like they're much easier to be indoctrinated.
yeah.
Like, and it's just such a racist way of thinking, like about other people. And I was like, oh, like the people here, they think of themselves like, like they have this independent thinking. But but I haven't seen any of these like independent thinking like anywhere. And like talking about the indoctrination, like if the indoctrination says like everyone is equal, like, and everyone has the access, like to the rights, like the human rights, like the like these material things, like education or the right to healthcare, like right to have representation, like with the union, like I'll take this kind of indoctrination like any day.
Mhm.
Okay. So, I don't
Me
care.
too.
Yes, like, and this is the difference, right? Like this is the difference, like why this is the indoctrination, but like other way of thinking, like it is not, like if you don't think that the other people, they deserve, like to have these things. Yeah, so it's like very like literally, but like thinking about, I have this story about Venezuela and about the sanctions because I did this talk um, sometime in February with this UK university about the sanctions and also how they might affect the research, like, and also the researcher, like the positionality and all of that. So I had this talk and it went very well, but, like literally the first, and I talked about the sanctions, and especially I mentioned that sanctions can be very harmful to they target specifically, like the most vulnerable within this or the vulnerable societies. And so I talked about Venezuela, like that there is this research, like more than 45,000 people died since 2015, like the predominantly young children, like and old people, sick people. And like the first question that someone in the audience asked me, how, like they complained that the Western academics now they can go to Russia to do their research, like, and if I want to talk about that, like, and my first response was, like the thing that I thought, I didn't say that, but but like because like I tried to be polite, but but the first like thought that I had after that question, like I don't give a shit, like about the Western academics, like who want to go to Russia, like and exploit more indigenous knowledges. Like I don't care, like, and why you can ask this kind of question, like when I just talked about how these sanctions affect the most vulnerable within these communities. So, like, and I was like, this is the state of the Western academia.
Yeah. It's like, how is this going to affect my access to these communities
Yeah,
versus
exactly.
like, how are these communities impacted by my government? There's no accountability on it,
Yeah, there is no any thinking about that. Yeah, so yeah, I was like, it is very disturbing. But I put it in my CV, okay? that I did.
Masha, we were just talking about sanctions, and Sardana was relaying this story about how a Western academic
I think I
asked her.
told Masha about that.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
how they asked about, well, how will this affect our ability to go study in Russia
Yeah,
versus like how is it actually impacting the
yeah.
community?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a also with the sanctions. Like I don't know if we've had this discussion like with a friend of ours or a colleague of ours when we had the conversation that we recorded for these for the podcast TYMSYY. And so over the summer we went to the Arctic, to the Russian Arctic, and or to the Sakha Arctic, I guess, in Sakha and in our homeland. And we were studying the impact of climate change on the livelihoods of the communities there, of the Sakha horse herders in the Verkhayansky Ulus, which is like a kind of a district or
The high Arctic.
region. And the sanctions were felt when we were conducting research because it's like we couldn't operate the drone because we wanted to have some drone footage because the software was not available. And then we had to like record the horses because the horses are quite wild, right? They're out in the wild and you can't approach them. So the footage that we wanted to take was of the horses kind of feeding a little bit farther away so that we wouldn't endanger of ourselves. Then we wanted to use the drones. The other part of it was also in terms of like how do we, because we did receive funding for the project, and then it was, how do we transfer the funds to the Russian account? And we couldn't do that. And so we had to carry cash. And so, and it was very daunting to carry a lot of cash that could be stolen at any point, right? Which means that it's like a personal liability, I guess. Like you're not going to be like, you'll have to replace it if you lose it, basically, right? Like if something happens to it. So that was pretty, I think that those were the two major impacts, I guess, of sanctions in terms of like the practical research. Yeah. So, and I think like in terms of the Russian, like in terms of the context, like what is the impact of sanctions on the communities? Like, because that wasn't like the subject of our research, so we didn't really look into that. But but I think like the Russian industries, they've been replacing a lot of the things that are lacking within the Russian market. I think that they were like, for example, I think somebody was talking about the cardboard, for example, that was being replaced, and then transportation was something that was being discussed a lot, I think, in terms of like how they're heavily impacted by the sanctions. So, and I think like, yeah, so those kinds of like, but the replacement is the main thing that's kind of on people's minds. I think, how do they replace the products that they can't access anymore?
There's also sort of this, I guess, informal or cultural sanctions that scales up to the level of the institution in terms of like, we're not going to privilege this kind of research. We're not going to consider this, this scholar because they're from this place and they're not critical enough, and of their government or whatever. And I don't think that, like, people think they know what imperialism is, but then they are they act imperialistically in terms of sanctioning like what is legitimate knowledge and what is not legitimate knowledge. And maybe I'd like to hear you reflect on that, because it's not just about like like navigating the academy, the Western academy, as Indigenous people, no matter what your perspective is, it's a perilous sort of journey. But I think when we talk about, you'd use this term cultural imperialism, it's not just like the theft of knowledge, the exploitation of knowledge, the exploitation of these communities for the things that they're producing, but it's also the academy itself has a sort of hierarchy. And I think of like Indonesia. The only things I know about Indonesia are what white people have written about Indonesia that I've read in grad school. I won't name names, but there's some like famous anthropologists who've like written a lot about Indonesia. Very few of them, talk about the genocide, against communists. Very few of them really kind of approach it, from the perspective of like, well, how was the US's involvement in this? And I'm coming from the US. Most of them just talk about sort of environmental rights, and the state and this and that, and like how Indigenous people are sort of a critique of the Indonesian state and its sort of authoritarianism or whatever. And the same could be said about the Russian context, but whether that's true or not is kind of beside the point, in my opinion, because it's like what grants or what gives you access to these communities in the first place. It's the color of your passport. It's a blue passport, and yeah, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thoughts, and it's like I feel like the thoughts are going all over the place. I feel like they're going all over the place because you could talk a lot about like different aspects of it, I guess, like in terms of like being an Indigenous researcher, like definitely like being in the global South, like you definitely, or like the periphery of the global economy, I guess, like you definitely feel those like kind of political economic relationships of like core periphery, semi-periphery type of organization of the global economy, and imperialism itself definitely influencing like the way people see me, for example, as a researcher, right? Because I'm not a white person, so, and I don't carry the blue passport or any kind of like Western colored passport, so I definitely kind of experienced that on myself, on my own skin. But I take it, but Russia also has a really good position in Indonesia, so like in that way, like people see me as Russian. um but um but I also have to sometimes point out that I'm not exactly like a white Russian, right? Like I'm not the kind of
Mhm.
Russian, like a regular Russian. And I don't carry that privilege of being a white Russian either. So I don't carry that like in myself, right? Like I could have pretended to be white, I guess, but I can't. It's just not there, right? So so I think like I realize all those complexities like whenever I'm presenting myself to people here, I guess. And then also realizing, I think, like as I was off, like my internet has it doesn't seem to be very stable today, but um when Sardana was talking about experiences about in terms of the Communist Party, like the complexities of the experiences that people have around communism and the history of the Soviet Union and its impact on young people and the kind of shame or like the negation of that experience that some young people tend to have in the Russian Federation right now. Like I was thinking about that whole, Communist Party of Indonesia and the genocide that happened. And so, and I think I don't know a study that looked at the impact of that on land struggles here. I think nobody really, because it remains to be a sensitive topic in the context of Indonesia. The genocide against the members of the not only members of the Communist Party of Indonesia, but it was like the biggest, I think at the time, even like it was the biggest party in the world, right? At some point, with millions of members, and it was a very kind of interesting time, I think, in the Indonesian history, whereas, the discussions were happening around land ownership and how, there was a kind of a transfer of capital between, from the Dutch colonizers, or like European colonizers, let's say, and, it was Dutch at some point, but also the English, and then the Japanese occupied the country as well. So, I think when the kind of political upheaval or like the changes, the transformation and the revolution was happening, and the struggle for independence was taking place, and in the aftermath of that, I think that like the Communist Party of Indonesia had a very interesting stance in terms of redistribution of land and all that. And so, and then there was a backlash against the party because of that. But also the US obviously played and the CIA, they played a really important role in terms of instigating the purge or the genocide against the members of the Communist Party of Indonesia. Not only the members, but also like just in general social activists and artists and all kinds of interesting individuals and intellectuals, like indigenous organic intellectuals of the time, and then putting in power the military leadership under Suharto's leadership, I guess the military folks under Suharto's leadership. So I think that's kind of, and then making it become part of that global neoliberal globalization itself. I think that's kind of like leading up to that, right? And then how that also connects to the history of Papua, like that we talked about with Sardana as well. We had a guest from a Papuan guest, a researcher who is now doing a doctorate study in New Zealand. So, and that's kind of like all of that history is kind of intertwined, right? So because of that, I think why the research is lacking, I think, is also because of the sensitivity of the topic, that it remains to be sensitive in Indonesia. Despite the fact that if I read the constitution, it's a very socialist constitution, and Sukarno, as the first president, he has a really good reputation too. So that's kind of, yeah. And then I think people are like, those discussions obviously are still to happen in the context of Indonesia. Like from the way I feel it is that, and when I was conducting research, that wasn't the objective of my research. So but I did pay attention to some of the discussions that were happening. And I think like the discussions around class is obviously missing in Indonesia. And I think, and that's part of that is also like a critical discussion around class conflict. And I think that's kind of what will need to happen, I'm guessing, in the future, if depending how Indonesia moves forward. Yeah, but that's a very important discussion that hasn't taken place in that radical way, and that I hear people saying that it needs to happen. Like young people say that, and there is, yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
No. I just, the only thing I know about this is like, I think Sukarno recognized Indigenous people for the first time, right? And am I correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's in the constitution. It's in the constitution actually. The masyarakat adat, it's called in Indonesian, and it's in the constitution. It's written in the constitution. And from what I remember, maybe I'm not remembering everything accurately, but like from what I remember is actually the discussions around the indigenous peoples in Indonesia happened with the Dutch researchers, and um, specifically Van Vollenhoven, and then that turned into an institute. And there were a lot of, at the time when Indonesia gained independence, and at the time when they were figuring out the constitution, writing the constitution, there were a lot of discussions happening around who the indigenous peoples are and how to recognize the indigenous peoples. So that's kind of like a really, like a lot of discussions happened around that. And so, yeah, and there is a recognition of the indigenous peoples in the constitution of Indonesia. And that kind of remains to be the basis for organizing for the indigenous peoples here, that recognition that exists there. And then also that recognition, and then also after the fall of the Suharto's after the fall of Suharto, his regime, then there was also a lot of organizing happening in Indonesia too, of the indigenous peoples. And I actually personally knew one of the founders of the indigenous peoples movement, the modern indigenous peoples movement in Indonesia, Pak Sombolinggi from Toraja, which is an indigenous community in Sulawesi, South Sulawesi. So, yeah. So that's kind of, there's a long history, but it's a very interesting history too of the indigenous mobilization here in Indonesia.
I was going to say, like, like about talking about the academic limitations, like, and what kind of research exists and what kind of research is encouraged, like, so you're not supposed to talk about some things, like, and you're more than encouraged, like, and funded to talk about the other things. So, like, one of the things that I noticed in the case of the indigenous political activism in Russia, like, they throw a lot of money to research where you talk about how the local indigenous peoples resist the Putin government. Like, if you do this kind of research, like, you'll be like rich, academically speaking.
That's your next career move.
Academically speaking. But like, if you do, like, like, if you plan to do, like, for example, research how the Western sanctions, they're affecting indigenous peoples, like, research that I was trying to do, like, there's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no one is interested to talk about that. like, no one is interested to
unless you're only going to get funded unless you try to overthrow the government. That's
yeah, exactly. And I was thinking, like, it's such a, like, because both of us, we do research with the on indigenous politics, right, and the political activism, and it's like, I always find that, like, you're political only when you're like participating in some kind of protest, like, against the government. That's it. Like, there is no any other way understanding of indigenous political activism. And I guess, like, it's true here, like, but it's not necessarily the fact, like, where we come from. But like, but also, like, I remember I had this conversation with this one anthropologist in one of the Canadian universities, and so I was kind of like talking about. I found this number of articles from the 1980s. In the articles in support of Leonard Peltier in the United States, and like, and the demand, like, so the collective, like, of students and the faculty of the local university in our home region, they collected the signatures, like, from the public, like, from the university, the students, like, and the faculty, like, more than 300 signatures, and they wrote a letter to the American government, like, to free Leonard Peltier. And they even wrote, like, one of the local poets like wrote a beautiful poem, like in our native language,
Wow.
to Leonard Peltier. And
Do you have a copy of this? Sorry.
I do have it.
I could share it with him if you
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
because anyways, sorry to interrupt
So
that.
anyway, so like, and I found like the so like profound, like, and so interesting, like, because now no one does anything like that. Like, there is no any practice of indigenous internationalism like that now. But this is like something, like the example from the 1980s, and I was like fascinated by that, like, and they published in this like very well known local newspaper, like in our native language, like, and it's a huge thing. So, and I was talking about that to that professor, and he was like, he like immediately dismissed it, and he was like, oh, like, it's the government doing, like, so the government, the government, like, like, kind of like ordered, like these, like, faculty and students, like, to come up with something, like, in order to support Leonard Peltier, because like there is a movement at the time, like, happening in the Soviet Union, right, in 1980s, like 1970s. And I was like, I'm looking at him, and I was thinking, like, this is such a limited and the reductive way of thinking about indigenous political activism. Like, so, and again, it's like, it's also very racist, like thinking that, like, indigenous people, like, they couldn't act by themselves, like, they're so brainwashed, like, they had to support Leonard Peltier because because the government, the communist government,
Forced them
ordered
to.
them. Yeah, forced them. And I was like, you know, you know,
He imagine that, held a gun to the poet's head and said, "You better write a
this beautiful poem."
you better write this beautiful poem."
And you have a deadline. No, anyways, yeah.
And it's also even possible that it wasn't even a poet who wrote it. It was just a regular, probably a villager.
Yeah.
And then they were like, it's because like poetry is such a common thing to do, like for
And
a
it
lot
sounds
of.
like, like the poem says, like, like, we root for you, like, we support you, like, as native people, we understand your struggle.
Mm,
And I was
yeah.
like, yeah, and I was like, I found that to be fascinating. But, like, here, like, when we talk about that, it's like it's a government doing. It's not people.
Right. And yeah, and the other thing also is like that's exactly the reason why I'm so like careful with any kind of research that you want to like start or like what you want to study, because like you never know how it's going to be weaponized, right? Like it's
Exactly.
like for example, the whole idea of decolonization, like the past year, like or like even a year before, I think, right after the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, then there were a lot of discussions, I think, in the West, in the US and everything, like decolonization and the indigenous peoples of Russia or something like that,
No one
along
cared
those
about
lines.
us
So then it's
before,
like, okay.
but like no one gave like any shit before. Okay, Masha, sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, and it's like all of a sudden it becomes a topic, right? Like of discussions of having different, like there were so many panels. Even I watched those panels on YouTube and I was like, oh my God. And then there is another like interesting discussions that are happening around, like, because I'm like in peace and conflict studies, like around indigenous peace building, right? And so for me, like it's just the discussions are just starting out. And so I'm just curious to see how, like, in which direction those discussions are going to go, especially in relation to the indigenous peoples of Russia. So, like, I'm just really curious because I'm so suspicious of every research that, like, right now, because like any research I understand can be weaponized for imperial purposes. So, so it's like, how do you navigate the world as a person that doesn't have a lot of privileges, right? Like as a researcher who doesn't have a lot of privileges, like you can't. Yeah, and then also I think part of it also is like being true to yourself and like wanting to um to be ethical and wholesome and in your research.
Yeah, it's there's this kind of push to, yeah, I guess like going back, the Ukraine stuff got me like thinking too, because even there was some, I don't know what they're called, like Eastern European studies people, I guess, who are using the language of decolonization and talking about the indigenous people of Ukraine, which there are recognized, indigenous people, the Tatars, but they were framing the entire Ukrainian population as indigenous, which I was like, and then also in need of decolonization. And I was like, this is, we've really gone off the rails here. But I also think, that it shows you that like, if like the stakes of this, and I think you're correct, Masha. So you have to be careful like, how you're using this language, because there is a real decolonization process. And it's fascinating to me that the people who are deploying this notion of decolonization in a place like Ukraine don't even care about the fact that they are part of a settler colony, in the Anglosphere, whether they're Canada, United States. It's like, you're so diehard against Russia, you're so diehard against China, but you have no conception of like of the reality of the place you actually live, or even talking about decolonization. And it's like, it's I think not just the war in Ukraine, but also the genocide in Gaza has exposed the actual hypocrisy of all of this. And it shows you like the stakes of like, getting it right in terms of like what we're actually talking about when we're talking about decolonization, and what it actually means for people in the rest of the world. I think it's a very important thing. And it's also like, I think what you both have been pointing out too, is that it's like, even just to do research, like let's say you just want to be an artist, or you want to research artistic expressions. I remember when we were in Norway for the Native American Indigenous Studies Association, and there was these calls for like, we need to support the Sami people in Russia. And it's like, absolutely. Why can't they come to this conference? Oh, Norway has banned them. So we are condemning the Russian government for something that Norway and all these other Nordic countries have done in terms of like banning people with Russian passports, not allowing them through. And all they were trying to do was come and do like cultural performances. But the impulse from some folks was, well, we need to condemn Russia. And it's like, wait, did Russia prevent them from traveling? No, it didn't. That's not what happened. It's like the passport control happened with the European Union, and specifically the Nordic countries. But we can't talk about that. It's all somehow Russia's fault that Norway is banning indigenous people from entering the country. And also goes back to like what Sardana was saying, even with the expressions of solidarity with Leonard Peltier. If you read the literature at that time, especially about the Indigenous international movement, there's all these groups that kind of sprung up. You have the World Council of Indigenous People, you have the Arctic Council, you have the Sami Council, you have the Treaty Council. Everyone's talking about these. And then when they talk about indigenous people from Russia, they're like, well, they weren't allowed by their government to participate in any of these things. And it's like, when you dig a little bit deeper, into some of these groups, though, that they're basically funded by NATO, and they were taking like a pro NATO line. And so it's like, why would you send, like, it doesn't make sense. Like, the United States was banning its own, indigenous people from participating in these world forums. They were suppressing them. There was a dirty war. Dozens of people were killed. Like, like in your word, and you're saying like Russia is somehow the boogeyman here. But then when they do express sort of solidarity in line with these actual indigenous movements, it doesn't get counted for anything. It's just, they're just dupes. So it is a, you're absolutely taking away the agency of people at that time, while saying that you kind of are offering a better solution with your, Western liberal kind of perspective. But anyways, I was just kind of rambling on and on about that. But the point is that even to do sort of that research, like when you're talking about filming horses, it's like, what's so threatening about this? but you can't even put a drone in the sky because they've deactivated, I'm assuming, the GPS satellites for that area, and you can't put, this piece of technology, you can't, pay or properly gift people who are participating in this research. But we're not condemning those sanctions, right? Like, that's not I haven't seen an academic association so far, whether it's Indigenous or not, condemn the sanctions on Russia for its impact on Indigenous research. But I think, anyways, I'm just kind of rambling, and I've seen a lot of these conversations happen, especially in Europe, and they come from this place of like, oh, we're trying to help Indigenous people, while actually normalizing and reproducing the sort of violence of the sanctions themselves, or
Yeah,
violence
that's
of
why, that's why, I mean, personal beef with the Circle.
personal beef.
Because, the first thing that they did, like in 2022, they like completely like banned Russia to be the member, like canceled the membership. And I was like, and they keep talking about the indigenous solidarity and such, global indigenous solidarity. And it was like, it doesn't look like indigenous solidarity to me, it just looks like you're following, like the imperialist discourses.
Yeah, and it's like, what's the percentage of the indigenous peoples in Russia anyways, right? And then you're banning them. You're saying that they're the ones who are
Yeah,
influencing
yeah.
politics within the Russian Federation. I mean, that's so far
But I
from the
was also
truth.
thinking, how our people, express solidarity. And I remember I talked to several people about that. Like since 1990s, like we have these children sport games. They're called, it's like, what is it? Like,
Children of Asia.
Children of Asia. So, and we have this, huge event, like I believe every 2 years. And most of the times since 1990s, they were taking place in the capital city, in our home region. And and one of the things, I got curious about, the whole history, and also most importantly, what countries were invited to participate, because it's Children's of Asia. And I looked up, the list of the children, who are interested in sport and who practice sport, like different kinds of sport, who attended, all these years, attended these games, which is the expression, in a sense, of the solidarity, right, with all the societies in Asia. And so I looked up the list, and it's like literally every nation in what we understand as Asia. Like we had kids from Palestine, like in 2024, I think. I imagine that they only like two of them, but it's like I find like it's a big thing. We had like every time we had children from North Korea. We have children from South Korea. We have children from China. We have children from Iraq. And all of this, in the Orientalist imagination way is, and so all of these nations, they send their children, to our super tiny, super isolated region in the Arctic. And we continue doing that, so our regional government, they consider that, to be very big legacy of our first Sakha president, who was one of the founders. And I was like, this is what the solidarity is, you don't look at the, it's not necessarily the fault of the children, what their governments do. And you just extend the invitation to all the children in Asia, but not from the nations which are the friends of Russia. And I find it to be fascinating, because this is how our people in a very expansive way, how we practice solidarity. But apparently it's not necessarily the practice of the of the other indigenous nations.
Yeah, it needs that rubber stamp of approval
Yeah.
from the from NATO before it counts.
Yes, yes.
Certified.
NATO certified.
NATO certified.
I had this. I came up with this term when you guys were talking, and I'm just going to introduce it here. But it's called the intellectual contra. You know, the contras
Oh,
who
yeah,
were
yeah, yeah.
against, yeah. So
Mhm,
they were against the Nicaraguan or the
mhm.
Sandinista government. And I was thinking about this, and it's like, yeah, we do have like intellectual contras within indigenous studies, within all academia. It's not just indigenous studies who sort of they're, you know, for a variety of reasons, they're anti-communist. They're against whatever enemy of the United States exists at the time, and they kind of spend their career sort of denouncing and also like red baiting or going after other people. And so I think I'm gonna. Sorry, I just had that thought. I thought I would share it with you because I'm gonna start using that to talk about people who are like who I would also call dupes of empire.
Yeah, and it's so sad that there's no critical thinking around that, like being academics, right? Like, how do you, like, I think the whole idea of reflexivity and positionality is like so important because of that, right? It's like I, I think that people have to realize like what are the positions that they're coming from, and so often people are not aware of the positions that they're presenting. Yeah, and then the other thing with the drone, though, I think we did get the footage eventually, but not without the software. You know, like the people who were operating our team, they figured out how to operate it without the software, so they did solve the problem. But yeah, but the software didn't work because of the sanctions, I guess. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation. We could keep going on with
I feel like we talked
stories.
like very little about the podcast itself.
We did
Maybe
no, but
we should.
we did, it was like the theme, like I think we, a very very it's not very often that we like, I mean, because we all work in different contexts, but it's not very often in the academy that we get to have these conversations. Sure, we might have it with fellow indigenous scholars, but this level of conversation I don't get at all, like even in my own workplace, for a variety of reasons. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody, but it's just that I really appreciated that the perspective. And I'm assuming that this is going to be the sort of, if it's not explicit, it's going to be the implicit sort of perspective of TYMSYY, your podcast.
Yeah, I think it's like it's bringing bringing voices forward and like building indigenous solidarity. I think that's something that kind of was also one of the ideas, like how do you build indigenous solidarities across contexts and like develop dialogue type conversations too, have those conversations, learning about each other's context, that there's so much diversity. Like there is over 300 million indigenous peoples around the world, right? So, and so many nations. So how do you actually make people talk to each other in some way, and yeah, build those solidarities? And so maybe there will be someone, like people in our part of the world, I mean, making poems about Peltier. That's a bit like, it's huge. And it wasn't even like Yakutsk newspaper, right? Like it was somewhere in the Arctic,
No. It
wasn't
was
it?
actually the. I mean, like it was one of the big newspapers at the time that pretty sure like it was distributed like all over. Yeah, but it was in our. It was yeah. But it was in our native language. Like it was in our native language, and it looked like like the what is the word, like the copies. Like it had like a lot of copies. Like so it was very uh, like well spread, like accessible newspaper, like at the time. Yeah, and I was like thinking that like also with our podcast, we're going to follow the tradition of our people and to be to be like very expansive thinking and also generous like about our solidarity. And that's why we say like in the description that like it's in the tradition of practicing indigenous internationalism.
Yeah, it's a tradition. It's something that always existed, and it something that can be further strengthened. So that's maybe, yeah. I agree with you, Sardana.
So when can we expect this podcast? How regular will it be produced? And where can we find it?
It's a very good question. Like we're still trying to figure out like the specifics and the details, but we'll keep you posted. We'll keep you posted.
Yeah, we're thinking of launching it, I think, within a few weeks, right? It depends on the person who's producing. On our boss. No. On our lead person, I guess, or like the person who is supporting us, Sina. But I think we're thinking, so we so far had, I think, like 6 or 7 or 8 conversations that we're going to be uploading, hopefully every once in 2 weeks, or we haven't really talked about the specifics, but what we're thinking about is that since the initial conversations have been in English, so we're wanting to move forward to like Russian language and Sakha language conversations, and perhaps also Indonesian language. So we'll kind of see what's coming up in terms of kind of incorporating those other languages that we speak. But we're very excited about it and the reason why we decided that it would be multilingual, because it's just that not a lot of people, like in the Russian context, for example, can speak English, and many people speak Sakha, and also many people speak Russian. So,
and
yeah.
like it'll be fun. Like like it's like, yeah, like, so to access more people, like in the, and it'll be interesting. Yeah, I'm very excited about this talking.
Yeah, yeah, and I think in terms of like making it accessible to the English speakers, maybe because I guess you can there are a lot more people who can speak English than, for example, Sakha. So we haven't talked about the specifics of this again with Sina, but we were thinking that maybe it's possible to dub or
Subtitles.
do something,
Subtitles,
yeah, subtitles or something like that. Yeah.
Because we're planning to have very interesting people, not only academics, okay? So yes, not only academics, like, but also artists, indigenous artists. Like, I'm very interested to I really want to invite the Sakha singer, who very generously provided us the opportunity to use her song as the introduction to the podcast. So like, you're going to hear the very energetic music, like very energetic, like our traditional music. Like, I really loved it. So like, and to talk to her, like, and see how the conversation will go.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the podcast. I probably won't be able to understand some of those languages. I'm pretty much only English speaking. Thanks, America.
We'll have subtitles.
No. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to it. And when we get this information, we'll put it in the show notes for people who are listening or who are watching this. You should be able to find it in the episode description. But yeah, I really appreciate both of you taking the time to come onto the podcast just to have a conversation. I'm glad to have met you, Masha, and great to have you back, Sardana. We should continue this conversation. Maybe we should have we should do another roundtable on this, because I think folks don't really quite understand how imperialism operates in the Western Academy, and what other Indigenous researchers throughout the world are doing. And we cover a lot of, we try to do some global perspective, but we don't always do it. And so you are feeling a niche, and you do have an expertise that many of us lack. And so this is great. I think it just demonstrates the diversity of approaches that we have. We're not all sort of uniform. There isn't just one sort of form of Indigenous research methodologies, and there isn't just one form of Indigenous podcasting and media production. So I'm very much looking forward to this podcast, and I will definitely be promoting it as much as I can on all of our platforms. So I really appreciate you both taking the time. If you have any sort of shout outs that you want to give at the end of this conversation, please do so. If you have work that you're working on, or a website or social media. I don't know if either of you are on social media. I don't know if social media is even really a thing anymore, but but just kidding.
I want to shout out on my own behalf, like to be very selfish. I need a job. Hire me. I'm very serious about that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have, active social media or anything like that. Like, I tend to be like, maybe I should get into it and think about it, but I'm just I think it's like it comes from like maybe this culture of humility that we have, that where you're like you don't position yourself to be an expert in anything. I think that's just not good. Good, like, it doesn't make sense within our culture, I think. But it's like, people tend to be very humble and like really down to earth. So I think that's the reason why I don't have social, like, I'm not active on social media, but maybe I should become more active. So if I do have, I'll give a shout out. And I'm in the phase of my life where, like, I think like this whole conversation around imperialism within Western academia in general, I think, or in academia in general too, I think not only Western, but also just in general, I think it's really interesting, because that's kind of like shaping a lot of the thinking that I have around, because I'm in a position where I'm trying to think about, like, what do I do with my life? Do I want to go into academia full time, or do I want to become a creator and, work on my own project? So that's kind of like where I am right now. So, but if I do have anything, I'll let you know. So far, it's TYMSYY, and please subscribe and listen to us. Yeah. And sometimes we're sleepy because, like, we have also time zone
We're
difference,
12.
right? Like,
We're 12. Yeah,
for
we're
me, it's
12 hours
nighttime.
apart.
Yeah.
So it's like almost 11 p.m. there, almost midnight.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of sacrifice.
So sometimes
Okay,
when we're having,
there is a lot
what
of
is it?
sacrifice in making this podcast.
Yeah, there's a 12-hour difference. But yeah. So if you have any ideas in terms of like how you want us to develop the podcast after you listen to the episodes, also feel free to let us know. We'll probably make a way to inform us available to us when we kind of finalize the podcast. So that would be really great to have
But
feedback.
also, like, I was just thinking that we could get the feedback and also some of the suggestions, like who we could have as guests in the podcast. Right, because like so far we've been inviting our friends, like, and colleagues.
That's what podcasting is about.
which is excellent. Yeah, which is excellent, because most of them, like, they are not they're young scholars, like, and they're researchers, and we want to support them. But like, eventually we're going to, like, come to the end of the list of our friends. More likely. So, like, we'll appreciate some suggestions, like, what if we start releasing the episodes.
Yeah, and it can be anyone, right? Like, it can be a scholar, it can be a an actress or an actor or an artist or
Yeah.
a,
We can try
writer.
to contact them, like an invite and see if they're interested.
Yeah, or a filmmaker.
Well, I'll certainly be in touch about some suggestions if I have them. But again, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, the name of the podcast is TYMSYY. It's TYMSYY. I think this is
Yes.
in Roman, whatever our script is. The English script, I don't know what it is. But it's pronounced TYMSYY, right?
TYMSYY.
TYMSYY.
Yes.
Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.